Welcome all. Thank you all for being here and for such a wonderful audience. As we sit here tonight, the House has voted for a short-term continuing resolution to keep the government open, and we'll see what the Senate does in the next 24 hours. So there are a lot of issues domestically and certainly overseas threats. But the one thing that I think is overshadowing everything that this administration has done, like it or not, in this first year, is the Russia investigation into 2016 and beyond. So let's talk about that, about the president, his national security team, how it affects them. You've worked in government, all of you. How do you do your business when you are being investigated by 4 committees, not terribly coherently at times, but certainly by a preeminent former FBI director and a crack team of prosecutors? Michael, if I could ask you.
Sure, and thanks to the 92nd Street Y and NBC and Andrea for doing this great event. Any time that you have congressional investigations, it really changes the dynamic in the White House and makes it very hard, in my view, to focus on the important issues. Now, honestly, at this point, it's not nearly as bad as it could be were there a Democratic House or Senate, in which case this investigative tempo would pick up exponentially. All in all, I think it makes it hard. From my perspective, the most challenging piece, though, is not the investigation. It's that it is slowing down. The investigation is important, has to be done, but it is slowing down the reasoned policy discussion about what the United States does with a resurgent, nationalist, expansionist Russia. That is the strategic issue that we're missing, because instead we are stuck in a partisan battle about this investigation.
And in fact, only this week, I was just in Vancouver for the summit that was held by Rex Tillerson and his Canadian counterpart to talk about the North Korea situation. And a good part of their discussion was what to do about Russia, Russia's cheating, as well as China's, but Russia's blatant cheating against the sanctions. Juan Zarate, you ran sanctions operations, and you were the first Assistant Secretary of Treasury to really follow the money against terror sanctions. But you and your successors worked on the Ukraine sanctions and the Iran sanctions.
Yeah.
You know how hard it is to plug these holes.
Yeah.
And with Russia cheating, and what they're talking about is boarding ships at sea. So this raises the threshold for an accidental or purposeful military exchange, because maritime engagements such as this can be very complicated. So far, all of their boarding exercises have been in ports of call for countries that are supporting the UN sanctions.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that that will follow.
No, that's right. And let me add my thanks, Andrea, to you and the 92nd Street Y and NBC and MSNBC for hosting this, a really important time for this discussion. You're right. I think Michael hit the nail on the head. I think the overhang of the investigation really does color the ability of the United States to focus clearly on the resurgence of an aggressive Russia, the ability of Russia and China to do things like evade sanctions, to serve as a backstop to perhaps Iran, North Korea, in the case of providing cyber and internet access, and a question as to how aggressive the United States should be and what that balance looks like. And I think I testified last week on sanctions before the House, and a core set of questions was, why isn't the administration moving harder on sanctions? Now, it's a completely fair question, but the question is distorted by the investigation, because it may not be that we want to exert more pressure via sanctions on Russia now. It may be that we want to use other forms of power to push back on Russia. The arming, for example, of Kiev with anti-tank weapons is a good example. But the whole shadow and penumbra of the investigation affects the way we're thinking strategically about how we deal with a reshaped geopolitical landscape where Russia and China are resurgent. Now, the one thing I would say is the national security professionals, many of whom we've worked with and we know closely, are trying to keep their head down. The problem with an investigation like this is it takes the oxygen out of the room and has the ability to distract at every moment of the day. But the national security professionals are trying to keep their head down, focusing on where the threats lie. And you look at the national security strategy that came out at the end of last year, it's actually a sober serious document. And in part, it looks at the rise of Russia and China. The challenge there, of course, is how does that match with the president's rhetoric, his policy, and as you said, the lingering investigation that we still have to deal with.
And there was a report last week from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Democrats, and it was not a bipartisan report, clearly. It was more than 200 pages, but it was actually a very well-documented report on Russia's social media use, the propaganda attacks, and what has not been done by Homeland Security and other agencies. They have not been mobilized to protect the electoral system in 2018 in the midterms. And instead, what the administration did was create this election fraud commission, which was, by all reporting, chasing a problem that did not exist, election fraud. And more than 20 states, including Mississippi, red states, refused to turn any data over to these commissions. They were asserting a states' rights argument that they did not want to share Social Security numbers and voter polls with this very partisan commission, so they finally dissolved it. They'd never even met. But instead of doing what needs to be done, Malcolm, which is to really create defenses and public education and work with the social media giants who are very slow to come to the table. What is your take on this? I mean, what the Senate Democrats said was that it was negligence on the part of the president to not direct his administration. And one inferred, because of reluctance to blame Russia, because he seems so sensitive about anything that he thinks would delegitimize his legitimate electoral victory.
Sure. Well, let me first go back to the first question, and both Juan and Michael put it very well. The people who are actually doing the day-to-day work in the U.S. intelligence community, they're not involved in this policy fight that's happening at the president level, at the congressional level. They are coming to work every day. They are doing their job, which is to keep the systems, the processes, the analysis for U.S. intelligence in a state of functioning and to keep you safe. You can go home and rest assured. The guys like who were at your National Counterterrorism Center are out there every day trying to keep you safe from the threats that are there. Now, with regards to cybersecurity and the Russia investigation, there's a complete disconnect between the White House and the rest of the government. If the president thinks that it's a hoax, great, he can think that it's a hoax. But the National Security Agency, U.S. Cyber Command, Central Intelligence Agency, National Geospatial Intelligence, whoever has a cyber warfare and cyber defense component assigned to them, whether it's DHS in a public-private partnership, they are doing their day-to-day job of keeping those systems online, trying to understand the threat as it manifested itself prior to the 2016 election, and they are trying to do as best as they can without any policy direction. Should we be defending ourselves for the 2018 election? Yes, but the place where that really is going to break down is at the state level. Many states were in a state of denial to a certain extent over the 2016 election. I actually got accused by a state, the Association of Secretary of States, of manifesting, panic, because I had said these systems had been probed and some had been hacked by the Russians. And they themselves, even though later on it would come out, the FBI would say it, they weren't ready to admit it. So long as no actual ballots were changed, they're happy. But when are we going to get to the point where ballots are changed? Why do you have to wait for that? We need a public-private partnership with DHS, national government systems, and very large-scale organizations to come and see this threat as it is and address it, even if the president doesn't want to take leadership on it.
We promised we were going to disagree up here, because otherwise everyone's going to get really bored. So.
Yeah, don't fall asleep.
You don't disagree with that.
I'll start. And really 2 points. I agree with most of what Malcolm said, but I actually am increasingly concerned. There's no doubt in my mind that the people who are working in the trenches are focused and trying to do the right thing. I think that there's been a degree of politicization of the intelligence community, of the security organizations, the FBI in particular. I think see some troubling signs in some of the statements coming out of the Department of Justice recently concerning some terrorism statistics, which I think were taken pretty deeply out of context, which is very worrisome to me, and I think does have a corrosive effect on the very good apolitical civil servants who knows what party they are, who are working any one of these issues, counterterrorism, North Korea, China, Russia. I'm less sanguine. It's not that they're all going to give up and go home or say, okay, we'll do whatever you want us to do. But it is corrosive, and it is problematic as we're trying to attract and retain the best and the brightest. The second piece is, I don't want to all lay this on President Trump's doorstep from the start. A lot of these problems got worse over the past 8 years. And no doubt that President Obama tried to address many of them. He tried to pivot to Asia, but the resurgent China and their aggressiveness in the South China Sea started then. Obviously, the invasion of Crimea and Ukraine was under Obama. So it's not that President Trump got a perfect deck and suddenly folded. It is that it was a hard deck with hard problems, and it's not clear that we're approaching any of those problems or many of those problems in the most strategic way possible.
Certainly Syria.
Yeah, and I think there are two strategic problems with all this. One is we're not looking forward not just to the 2018 election, but to a very different form of influence and warfare that the Russians have doubled down on and demonstrated to our adversaries and competitors. That is to say, they are using information warfare, they're using cyber tactics as an asymmetric way of influencing and as a way of undermining confidence in democracy. And it's not just in the United States, right? It's in Europe. We've seen it in Europe. You've seen the Baltic states worried about this. You've seen reports about concerns about the upcoming Mexican election. And so this is a very real sort of new domain and tactic that we have to think about, that not just the Russians will continue to use because it's been low cost, effective. You see, we're eating our own young here in the middle of what they've done. But the Chinese can do it. A non-state actor can do it, like an Al-Qaeda or a Hezbollah. So that's really dangerous, and we're not focusing on that. The other point, and it goes to Michael's really important insight about the corrosiveness to individuals. This is also a moment where we need confidence in our intelligence community and our law enforcement community, not just because they defend us, and not just because they're important institutions, but because we're in a period where we are dealing with these asymmetric threats, where we need them to explain and evidence what it is that's happening. We have to believe our intelligence community. We have to believe the FBI when they say we can attribute these attacks to Russian front companies or Russian agents or Chinese army officials who are sitting at their cyber command trying to infiltrate. It's essential because it then defines how we respond as a nation and respond internationally with legitimacy, with sanctions and other measures.
And how is that undermined?
It's completely undermined. I think, and this is where the fake news sort of mantra is really damaging, I think, from a national security perspective, because it's precisely now that we need greater confidence in our ability to understand the threats, the actors, the ways that they're influencing, because they're doing it in more sophisticated ways and ways that aren't obvious. These aren't flag-waving attacks. These are attacks that are being purposely obfuscated, purposely shielded through non-state actors. We know the Russians use not just trolls and front companies, but they use organized criminal organizations and other networks that allows them to distance the Kremlin from what they're doing. The Chinese do something similar. The North Koreans have as well. So this is a moment where, and this is sort of putting the lawyer's hat on, this is where being able to prove what we're saying is true is actually true. And it's our ability then to retort when President Putin or President Erdogan or the leaders of whatever state you can imagine say, you can't prove it. You can't prove it. These are fake pictures. These are fake documents, et cetera. So this is a key moment where we need confidence in our information and our institutions. And we're unfortunately undermining that.
If I could just make a point, I think part of the problem, and I started, as we all did back in the Cold War, and what we're missing today is we don't see that all of these global adversaries as ideological enemies the way we had with the communists, right? We had democracy and you had communism, and what you did was you used every component of the military, diplomatic, and intelligence sphere to push your version of democracy. The Russians did the same thing, to push communism out there. Their system collapsed. When that collapsed and terrorism, came on 9/11, our entire how can I put it? Our focus went down to counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and whereas our terrorist opponents see it as clash of civilizations. But we no longer see China, Russia, North Korea, Iran as anything other than geopolitical and economic opponents, right? We don't have that big picture enemy that we used to have. So we've lost our focus, to the point where this year we removed democracy as part of the State Department's global platform for what we would push around the world. It's now just economics. And until we figure out what our strategy is for the rest of the world, China will eat our lunch in Africa economically. They will push themselves geopolitically everywhere they want. North Korea will taunt us into a war. And Russia, of course, will pick up the pieces, which they're doing right now.
Well, let me talk about a couple of particular areas of conflict that the administration is facing and the world is facing. One is North Korea. And most urgently, the administration, Tillerson, this week setting the line that we still demand that they denuclearize. Most experts don't think that they are going to give up what they already have. They may rest on what they've achieved. But the fact that North Korea and South Korea are now talking is, many people feel, a good thing, but there is concern in Japan, concern in the administration, which they haven't fully expressed, that this could lead to a weakening. And now I think we saw a report today that the South Koreans are drawing down on some of their military.
Yeah, and potentially even their interdictions. And I think the concern that you're describing that the Japanese have and that American officials have has to do with the sense that the North Koreans have a playbook. They have a playbook that they go back to use diplomatic entreaties, these symbolic acts of détente as a way of softening resolve while they continue their pace on the nuclear program.
We saw it under Bill Clinton, and we saw it under George W.
Yeah, and you can track it, actually. There's been lots of studies done around the moments where the North Koreans try to do this, to both lessen pressure, to garner something that they need, either legitimacy, oil, economic relief from the international community. And so I think that's the concern that you have at a moment where there's galvanizing pressure on the North Koreans in a way that you haven't seen recently, that the North Koreans are playing that. I will say this for the administration. I think they've done a good job of two things. One, adding urgency to this issue. They came in and said, look, this era of strategic patience with North Korea is over because we're about to reach the point where they can put a nuclear warhead on an ICBM that can hit any spot in the United States. So there's urgency to this, diplomatically, in terms of intelligence. Secondly, they have saber-rattled in a way, and often with tweets and such, in too bellicose a way, and perhaps even too dangerous a way, but they have done it in a way to try to reframe the calculus, to say the military option is a real option. It may be horrific to imagine, but it's a real option because the alternative is not acceptable to the U.S., and therefore the Chinese have to change their calculus. Now, how you do that, it takes some diplomatic artistry. It's not clear if it can be done well enough or quickly enough.
Yeah.
But I will say the administration has tried to do those two things.
And it requires a Picasso. We've got finger painting going. So we've hit the second point of disagreement. I agree with you that the administration was right to put this at the forefront of the issues of strategic importance. And we also have to give credit to the Obama administration, which made it quite clear. This is the biggest problem we're leaving you, that you have to focus on.
That's what President Obama
So
told
this was
the president-elect in
consistent
the
between
Oval
two
Office.
parties,
This is what you're going to deal with.
Exactly. The piece where, and I think the basic idea of galvanizing the team against North Korea, trying to get the Chinese to be even more forceful, because that's where 85% of the trade comes from anyway. This is clearly the most important piece. The Russian piece, frankly, I think is, if the Chinese piece comes into play and works, what the Russians do is almost irrelevant. But in painting this picture that they tried to paint, they left a huge opening for North Korea to do exactly what North Korea is doing. Because when you have a president tweeting and talking as if, frankly, Japan, and the South Koreans barely matter to your strategy.
Yeah.
That you're going to do it alone and whatever, well, if a few million South Koreans get killed, that's how it goes, which is about the tenor he's taken, then we shouldn't be at all surprised that we provide an opening for the South Koreans to say, boy, we better focus on this ourselves and do what we think is in our best interest, because it isn't clear that the traditional alliance we have with the United States is what it has been for 60 years.
and
so I think
We have a
gave
slight
North
disagreement
Koreans
here,
an
but
opening.
yeah.
But to make the point that Michael was just making, when I got up on January 2nd and saw that first tweet, my nuclear button is bigger than his, I was horrified.
No, I think everyone was. I think that's right.
Having covered North Korea, I've been to Pyongyang a number of times. I've traveled there. I was there with Madeleine Albright in 2000. I've seen how grim it is. We did the reports on the slave camps. But fire and fury comes from, of course, that Bedminster news conference that he had. So, Juan, how do you raise the rhetoric this way and give Kim Jong-un the personalization? The North Korean leader had never before gone on television and personally attacked the President of the United States. It was always done through, the presenter, the woman in the pink dress.
Well, but the pink dress is lovely. I just want to know.
It looks great on you.
the other woman in the pink. But this time, he went on television after Bedminster, after Fire and Fury, and he made a personal attack. You don't want to have these two untested leaders going at each other in this way.
You don't want to be flippant about it, obviously. I mean, that's the first thing. No one should be flippant about the use of nuclear weapons, even the President of the United States. My point is simply that there had to be a change of some element of the calculus, because the status quo was simply to have the Chinese continue to certainly not pressure North Korea. And I'm not suggesting that it's worked yet, but you have had 2 Security Council resolutions that are much tougher. They've been unanimous than ever before. You've had the Chinese beginning to shut down coal trade, mining trade that's been essential to the North Korean economy. The North Koreans have been feeling it. Some argue that it's part of the reason they've reached out to the South Koreans, but they've called these sanctions acts of war. There's been more cooperation on the law enforcement and intel side between the U.S. and the Chinese on this. The Russians a bit of a wild card and an outlier. The South Koreans and the Japanese and Americans have been doing trilateral operations and activities. So this is where I disagree with Michael. There's been, under the political level, an enormous amount done together, to include interdictions of shipping that has been suspect. So I'm not suggesting that this is all artistry at the highest order. Ready for the Met, but there had to be some change in tone and tenor. The question is what comes next, because nobody wants war.
That's what I want to ask you. Let me ask all 3 of you. There is talk, and H.R. McMaster has put this out there, of a preemptive strike. And then a bloody nose, a punch in the nose was the description of some kind of limited way of getting their attention, but using a nuclear weapon. Let's go, is that a good idea?
I'm careful to put my military tactical hat on against H.R. McMaster, a brilliant strategic tactical military thinker, but I think it's crazy. I do not.
No.
I do not think that there is a tactical solution, and I think the risks posed by a tactical solution when your enemy doesn't really know what you're doing are enormous, and it would be cataclysmic to have large-scale combat on the peninsula.
Yeah, and I have to agree. I mean, I've been hammering this for over a year now. I'm not a North Korean expert, but I have been under sustained artillery bombardment, and I know just exactly, if I can multiply what little I got times 14,000 rounds every 60 seconds of chemical, biological, and high explosive dropping into the DMZ in the city of Seoul. I've been Scud attacked, so imagine hundreds of those, and then one of them has a nuke on it in the Korean theater of war. Anyone who even starts to think that they are aware and know what will happen if they decide to push this envelope is either, 1, committing military malpractice, because there's just some realities you're going to have to face. They're a nuclear power. They have nuclear weapons. They have the ability right now to hit Anchorage, Alaska, and maybe Seattle. When the president opens his mouth or his tweet, he is betting the lives of the American citizens in those two cities at a minimum. Not to mention they can nuke Tokyo, Osaka, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Beijing, with just what they have active in theater right now. And they could devastate that peninsula. So when you say, I'm going to do a bloody nose attack. I've been involved in a lot of attacks in the third world, cruise missile attacks. All right, these people are not going to be using sophisticated radars and jets to shoot them down. It's going to be guys with guns pointing in the air, and they'll shoot down half of those cruise missiles. But what you are betting is that they will not decide to only use 5,000 of the 14,000 tubes of artillery they have, and only on U.S. forces on the DMZ, in which you might lose 200 or 300 Americans. But at that point, you have bet that the Second Korean War is fine with you. And as you said a little earlier, you've bet the lives of every Korean, every Chinese, every Japanese, and every person in the air on an airplane, because if a nuke goes off, airplanes start falling out of the sky. If they surface detonate a nuke on the water, you kill people on ships that you didn't know about. This is mind-bogglingly stupid. Now, I'm just a senior NCO, right? I'm a the equivalent to a sergeant major-ish, Navy senior chief. And you know what? You know why we're the technical experts in the military? Because we do the work. And our job is to keep stupid officers straight. And in this circumstance, why is H.R. McMaster not have an old master sergeant come up and say, General, you know that's crazy. Give me another cup of coffee. So this is how they are betting people's lives. Geopolitically, must look interesting, must be fascinating. People will be writing PhD dissertations about this for some time. I would never, ever think of betting the lives of my warfighters and the citizens of my nation and the citizens of other nations for such a silly idea. They are dismantling diplomacy. This is a diplomatic situation. It is not open to war, because when you open that Pandora's box, and by the way, you said, finger painting and this needed an artist. Yeah, these two guys are trying to do a piece of art. The problem is it's Guernica, right? And they don't particularly care whether it's done with crayon or whether it's done with blood. And that's where we have a problem right now.
Let me both agree and then temper a little bit of the criticism, because there's no question doing something to bloody the nose of the North Koreans or to take a shot is an enormous risk for all the reasons Malcolm and Michael have noticed, in part because we just don't understand the North Korean calculus. They don't understand what our calculus is. And they've also made an art form of brinksmanship on their part, right? Keep in mind, they've sunk a South Korean naval vessel with no response. They've shelled South Korean islands with no response. They've hacked American companies like Sony with no response. And so they're conditioned actually to punch back pretty hard and expect no response. And so in that environment, you just don't know what they're going to do. But I would just sort of relieve the crowd a bit. H.R. McMaster is a brilliant man. I know him personally for years and have watched him. He understands the consequences. He's been in war. And so he's not necessarily being flippant. I think part of this is trying to send a serious message that there is a possibility. And I would just point to the reaction from the Chinese over the past few weeks, where the Chinese have actually declared that they would not defend the North Koreans if the North Koreans took a first strike at an American site or at a third country site and the U.S. were to respond. That is a major statement from the Chinese state. And I would say that that is a reaction to a bit more of the pressure, a bit more of, I'm not saying the tweets have done that, but a bit more of the change of tone has actually forced the Chinese to reconsider what their strategic interests are. And so I don't disagree. You don't want to do this. The variables are way too many, and the costs are way too high. But there may be a purpose behind some of this rhetoric to get the calculus to change so that we don't have to go to war.
Let me just suggest, before we move on, I want to talk about Iran, that one good first step might be to have a U.S. ambassador in South Korea, for instance.
Our nominee, Victor Cha, is the best nominee you could imagine.
He's not
a
been
real
nominated.
expert. He's dealt with the North Koreans before.
Well,
I worked with him in the White
We're
House.
still waiting for the nomination to be
Yeah,
set.
it needs to happen quickly. I don't know what's going on, but he needs to get out there.
Bring his gas mask.
Let's talk about Iran, because lot of the policy that this administration has framed in the region, in the Gulf, is all connected to Iran. The first trip to Riyadh, the first foreign visit by the president, the undoing of the Iran deal if he gets his way, and also this military statements about what we're about to do in Syria. So let me ask you about the sort of the framework of Iran. First of all, how much is Iran a terror threat that needs to be addressed more importantly than the nuclear deal to be protected?
Well, I think I tend to associate myself with the Obama administration on this one, which is Iran is a horrible regime in many ways, to include being the largest single state sponsor of terrorism over the past 3 decades. And Hezbollah continues to be, it's not even a terrorist organization. Hezbollah is fundamentally a nation state army, sub-nation state army. The Quds Force sponsors terrorism. They target Americans in lots of ways. It's a very dangerous organization, and it's a dangerous regime which is repressive and is contrary to U.S. interests, national security interests in countless ways. All that being said doesn't answer the question of whether or not you want a nuclear deal. Because if you can't change what I first described instantly, then I'd at least rather have that very bad country and its proxies not have nuclear weapons. It doesn't solve the problem of Iran, but it may make the problem of Iran a little bit more manageable. The other piece I think people need to understand about Iran, I think many do, they've seen this over the past couple of years, the Middle East is having sort of 2 civil wars simultaneously. It's having a civil war of its people against its leaders. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that upheaval in Libya and Egypt and elsewhere, with differing outcomes in many of these countries. And the second civil war is the Sunni-Shia civil war. And it is largely a proxy war, but not entirely. There's cyber war between Iran taking out Saudi computers for Aramco. It is a Sunni-Shia war in Syria. It is a Sunni-Shia war in Yemen, which is a proxy war between Saudi and the Emirates on one side and Iran on the other. This is a hot war. And I think the president has mishandled it quite badly in many cases, but at least I think understanding this Sunni-Shia divide in that first meeting in Riyadh, recognizing that was good, his approach to it, in my view, was not, which was only seeing the good on one side and seeing none of the potential on the other. And I think that has posed a real challenge for them, trying to find a more nuanced approach, both to the very serious problems in the Sunni world for that first civil war and how we deal with democracy and rights and trying to make that a more stable environment, and dealing with this second civil war, which is more complex than simply Sunni good, Shia bad, Iran Shia, Iran bad.
And how did the protests, which have died down somewhat, but were different in that they were national, they were working class, not elite, not the students, how did those protests against the regime complicate the administration's challenge in cracking down on Iran, on its nuclear, rather on its non-nuclear issues, mission proliferation, as well as the continuing support for terrorism?
Well, it both complicates it and it offers an opportunity. It complicates it because the question of how do you support human rights, how do you talk about regime, maybe even regime change in Tehran, while you're also dealing with the nuclear deal and what happens to that, while you're trying to push back in these different arenas, as Michael described so well. It just adds another layer on the chessboard that you have to then deal with. And I think it's an interesting example because I think much of the current administration's approach to Iran is an attempt to expiate the sins of the prior administration, in their view, which is to say that the prior administration was seen to have leaned too far in favor of Iran, to have said to the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians, you have to make room for the Iranians. And the idea that the nuclear deal, with some of the economic relief and some of the money for the hostages, really gave wind to the sails of the Iranians and gave them license in some ways to be more aggressive in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, et cetera. in a way that made things more complicated rather than less. And so, in some ways, what you see in the administration is an attempt to sort of rectify that imbalance, which explains the Riyadh trip up front. The opportunity here is, and you see it from a sanctions perspective as well as just from a policy perspective, is to say, look, this is a dynamic relationship. We obviously have seen that the Iranians have proven to be incredibly destructive and not cooperative in places like Syria, et cetera. The deal is imperfect in a lot of ways. Everyone can agree to that. And the fact that there are human rights abuses and these protests are about corruption, around economic inequity, gives them the opportunity to reveal what the Iranian regime is actually doing. What are they doing with their money? They're supporting the Quds Force efforts to support these proxies. So a lot of these protests were about, forget what's happening in the hinterlands, worry about Iran, right? Home first.
Part of it was sparked by, many people believe Rouhani leaking the budget and showing how the Revolutionary Guard was spending their money.
Exactly. And so this is the opportunity, because the opportunity that the Iranians have always given the West in terms of their own isolation is the fact that the Revolutionary Guard, which is the protector of the revolution and the military shock force for the regime, owns much of the economy, or at least key elements of the economy. That brings great tension internally. It also creates great suspicion externally. So they can be isolated with sanctions and financial regulation. The fact that there's corruption feeds into this global attention on corruption, which has affected Pakistan and Brazil and Mexico. This is not unique to Iran. This is actually centered in Iran in many ways, the use of bonyads by the regime to profit, et cetera. So this is an arena where now you've seen Congress playing and the administration playing, where you can impose sanctions, expose inequity, expose corruption as a way of isolating the regime and pushing back in a way that begins to push very centrally in Tehran, not just in the Straits of Hormuz or in Yemen.
But of course, the problem here is this was not a bilateral agreement. Mm-hmm. The nuclear agreement was a six-party agreement involving Russia, China, Germany, France, and England. And they have all pleaded at the leader level with the president not to blow it up. Yeah. And so how can he, if he can manage this to his satisfaction, it's a miracle. But how can he get Europe to agree to something that they say flatly they will not do, Michael, which is to renegotiate the core of the nuclear deal, and get Congress to add new terms to something that they never ratified because it was never submitted for ratification, because Obama knew it couldn't be ratified.
Let me put, first of all, I think I agree with everything Juan said. It was a really nice encapsulation of a lot of points.
That's a first. We have that on tape?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we do.
Juan and I worked together for many years, and I'll tell you one thing. I'm not the least bit surprised. Let me put the best spin on this I can. Flatly walking away from the deal is I think, bad for national security purposes, as, by the way, Jim Mattis said, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs also said. People within the administration have said, hey, Mr. President, don't walk away from this. So the best spin is you threaten to walk away. It would be a diplomatic disaster to walk away for the United States. It would isolate us as much as almost anything the president has done, I think, in the past year.
And except perhaps Paris.
Well, I was going to say, that's already a pretty high bar. It would probably be the worst. But if you can threaten that and then work with those same nations, Group 6, to put additional pressure in other areas, say, fine, I will live with the nuclear deal even though I think it's the worst deal ever. But we have to get tougher on their funding of terrorism. We have to get tougher on the ballistic missile piece, which was excluded, which is not subject to part of the deal. Then that is the way you potentially strike a deal and come out of this with more pressure on Iran, which is not necessarily a bad thing, and a united international front.
I agree. I've argued publicly, I've testified before the Senate, you don't have to walk away from the deal to get what you need here. In part because there's a huge contradiction in the deal, which is a bit of a diplomatic play on what was happening. We promised to give sanctions relief to the Iranians for nuclear sanctions, but we reserve the right to use sanctions and other pressure to confront on everything else. what's happened, and this is a bit of a criticism of the Obama administration, we kind of let off the gas on everything.
Right.
And there's been some controversy around that. But in any event, you can pressure around the deal. You can pressure further through the deal. You can say, look, we want tougher inspections pursuant to the protocols of the deal. And you can seek, like any other arms treaty, to negotiate new provisions. This is a 15-year deal, for God's sakes. Is it going to be static forever? It wasn't a treaty. So it's completely reasonable to revisit the sunset provisions, or the allowance for Iranian research and development, or the fact that the Iranians are sitting down with the North Koreans, which I find just remarkable, to be talking about proliferation, et cetera. So I think there's no reason, to Michael's point, to walk away and to self-isolate internationally when you can get most of what you want through the deal and around the deal. And put the onus on the Iranians to demonstrate to the world their legitimacy as opposed to the other way around.
Well, I wanted to also ask you about Iran and cyber. All of you are experts on that, and North Korea and cyber, as a matter of fact, because Russia and China were the leading causes of difficulties that we had. The State Department computers were shut down after a Russian hack in 2015 for a month. The State Department computers, as old and outdated as they are.
That may have helped.
No one noticed.
That may have helped.
That may have helped. Well, Colin Powell, who actually was pretty savvy about computers and was on the board of at least one tech firm when he became Secretary of State, came in and discovered they had Wang computers in 2001 in the State Department. I mean, it's just, so the criticism of the technology there is pretty profound. But the fact that Russia had hacked us, but now you've got new actors getting involved, Malcolm, in cyber. And North Korea has certainly shown, not just with Sony, but with WannaCry, with the hack of the Bangladesh Central Bank, they've been using it as a criminal enterprise to earn money for their weapons proliferation.
Absolutely, and everything that you've seen out of North Korea, even some of the things out of Iran, these are just little amuse-bouches, right? This is just the way that they're just playing to test the limits of what they.
Can I say, I have never heard a non-commissioned officer say amuse-bouches and Guernica in the same event.
Intel guy.
He was also a case officer. He was a case officer.
So, we're all very funny in our world. You should come down to the Chiefs mess more. That being said,
That would be surprising.
That being said, they are just testing the limits of their capabilities. I mean, you're talking about a small, isolated country. You're talking about World War II level weapons systems, and trying to become a nuclear power. They are going to try every asymmetric thing that they can, every system that they can develop. I mean, this is still a country that lands spies and commandos by mini-sub, right? And are very good at it. You don't think about those things, and the one thing you would think is North Korea doesn't have any computers. Well, they do have computers, and the computers that they do have come from China. And what they are very good at is rudimentary, fundamental, using those systems to go out and hack. They would also be another global weapons system in the event that we do something ridiculous, like take a strike at them or try a cyber warfare operation ourselves. I mean, anybody can go out and get like the Mirai botnet, which shut down major parts of the world's computer systems a couple of years ago. Well, North Korea has that capability too. To them, I think it's just another weapon system like nerve gas or sarin gas. It's just something which they have in their arsenal, and if they can generate funds from it, they will generate funds.
And they have.
They have, absolutely. Iran, same thing. Their cyber army, they tested trying to take control of a dam in the Pacific Northwest from Iran just to see if they could turn the valves on and off in that dam. Now, you might think, wow, they were going to flood, the Willamette River Valley. No, they just wanted to see if that could be applied as a cyber weapon system. But you would never think of Iranian systems going up in the Pacific Northwest to flood someone downstream. Well, they do. And we need to consider all angles and aspects of this. Now I come from the intelligence part of the world where I prefer to kill the operatives by blowing their facilities up, and then I don't have to worry about cyber warfare. But they take that into consideration too. And they are dispersed. They don't. Whoops. They're dispersed. They don't actually have to be concentrated into a cyber warfare command post. They could be in 400 different souks around Iran, and same the way that Russia uses criminal and other volunteers.
I've talked to directors of Central Intelligence going back decades who've talked about the need to develop a better cyber command. Yet I still have the impression that we're not really competing as well as we need to in this space.
I think, I wouldn't agree with that. I would
That's
say
comforting.
a lot of the issues we've talked about, I'm not quite sure North Korea, I find much optimism yet. The Olympics are a step, but a very small step. Iran, 10 years from now, I can actually see a more optimistic future for relations with Iran, democracy. Russia, I think I'm optimistic in 10 years because frankly, fundamentally their petrol economy is going to die and they have real problems. Cyber is going to be here and just as bad, if not worse, in 10 years. Mm-hmm. And we at the high end are still the best people in the world in this. We have a national security agency, we have a cybercom, we have a variety of organizations across the US government that are very, very good at defense and even better at offense. The challenge is we also live in the biggest glass house in the world. Yep. This is also starting to change, but we are still largely the most wired society, the most technologically integrated society in the world. Whether it's critical infrastructure of our dams or our energy systems or our telecommunications network, everyone here or many people sitting in this audience are now reading their iPhones because this is too long. But on your iPhone, you have information about your banking, your healthcare, your communications, pictures of your kids and grandkids. Your whole life is on that mini computer. And that produces an enormous amount of vulnerability. And it's very, very hard from the individual all the way up to the critical infrastructure system to the government to protect all that. And what Malcolm mentioned about North Korea and Iran, I think is true. These are countries who feel like they have much less to lose, more difficult to deter on cyber, and hence are willing to use it more. And we as a country and as a world have not yet developed the legal regime, the theoretical deterrence regimes, an understanding of what really is war, what's just stealing, what's a problem. And at the same time, the ability to perpetrate all of these things from the high end to low end are proliferating wildly. So the North Koreans don't have to be great at it. They just have to have enough Bitcoin to hire the out-of-work Ukrainian software programmers. Or, God forbid, they just get the NSA exploits that the NSA lost. So there are a lot of challenges in this, and this is one that's going to be with us for a long time, and it's going to hit us in many ways.
Okay.
I want to interrupt to bring in the audience in some of our questions from them. So let's talk, can you speak about Israel and the future of a peace process? Something that we've all been wrestling with. The president's decision to announce that Jerusalem would be the capital of Israel was certainly declaring something that is obvious, but it's also taking off the table something that was always going to be, since Oslo, at the end of the process, where Israel would have to give something up, which would be some measure of land in the West Bank, and the Palestinians would get some part of East Jerusalem, where Palestinians are already living. That now is moot. I'm heading to the region tomorrow with the vice president on a visit that was delayed precisely because of anger in the region over this decision. So now we're leaving tomorrow. We're going to Egypt, Jordan, and of course 2 days in Israel. And there are no meetings with Palestinians. Originally he was going to meet with the Palestinians. He was going to go to Bethlehem. Now no Palestinian is on the schedule, and it will be an issue. Not a primary issue when he sits down with the Egyptian president and with King Abdullah in Jordan, because they have such important security concerns that they're not going to blow up their own relationship with the U.S. Over the Palestinian issue. But Juan, where is the peace process? There is no peace process. There's no peace plan, which has been long promised. Yeah. There are no talks, and both sides, I think, are responsible in some measure for the fact that there have been no viable talks since 2014.
Yeah, I think it's stalled at best, obviously, and some would argue even non-existent. Part of it has to do with the parties on the ground not really moving toward a resolution, whether it's a two-state solution, some hybrid one-state solution or something else. There's been no real tangible movement in that direction. I think some of us were hoping that the Jerusalem move, the move of the announcement of the move of the embassy, was maybe part of some grand maneuver to try to get the Palestinians to move using Saudi auspices, right? There was a lot of discussion in that regard, getting concessions from the Israelis at the same time. But that doesn't seem to have materialized if it was ever in the thinking. And it seems, to your point, to have been a chip sort of given away in the negotiation process, which is a real shame because all of these maneuvers have different diplomatic effect at different times, and I think you would hope that that's the case. There's two other interesting dynamics, though, happening in this regard, aside from this sort of stalled process. One is that you have had this rapprochement between the Sunni Arab states and Israel, which has really been a dramatic
And that is the big
reshaping
bet
of
of
the
this
environment, which is good. It's good, and you've seen the U.S. try to support that, amplify it, enable it. So that's an interesting dimension of this because you could see the movement around the recognition of Israel, elements of the Sunni Arab states pushing on the Palestinians in ways that if the parties want, you could see some movement. So that's helpful, a helpful dynamic. Another dynamic which is important to keep in mind is we've always talked about this as Middle East peace because the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been so central to the sense of stability and conflict in the region. The challenge with that is there is so much more going on. To Michael's point, exactly. the broad dynamics, not to mention the local civil wars, the fracturing of societies. And so we haven't yet reframed our thinking about this to say, look, the resolution of Israel and Palestine is really important for the people of Palestine, for the people of Israel, for safety and security of our allies and others. But it's not going to solve the problems in the region. And I've even argued we need to stop calling it Middle East peace because Middle East peace is something much broader, much deeper, much more fundamental to how the region sees itself and how it governs itself. And so I think we need to move away from that delusion and realize what's happening on the ground and frankly stoke some minor steps to at least get the parties to talk about concrete things they can do together.
Although I should point out also that this decision, a pending decision to increase the amount that is cut from the Palestinian relief, the UN Palestinian Relief Fund, is really galvanizing opposition to America right now because this is a 40-year program that goes back.
The process is dead.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Juan said it in a much more diplomatic way. But the process is dead. It's not going to happen, certainly in this 4 years, and if the president's reelected, unless he makes a radical turn, there's no chance of Palestinian-Israeli peace.
You're absolutely right. And this feels very funny to me. I mean, I've worked this mission from go, and every time there was a hiccup in the peace process between 1981 and recently, I would just prepare for a major terrorist attack. There's a weird dynamic going on right now where the Sunni leadership throughout the Middle East, which is the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, are all sort of saying, okay, maybe we can just let this whole Palestinian thing go. You mentioned a little bit earlier about there being two civil wars going on in the Middle East. Imagine a Middle East-wide civil war where the street feels that 50 years of negotiations have been betrayed by their leaderships. And when they said they announced the movement of Jerusalem, I didn't think, well, the Palestinian peace process is dead. I thought ISIS has just been saved regional-wide. Imagine Hamas, a terrorist group, which was democratically elected in an election that we backed. Imagine them being displaced and assassinated by people who finally decided maybe ISIS was right. Maybe ISIS-type ideology, extremist religious ideology needs to come into Gaza and the West Bank to confront this reality that we now have no leadership and that everyone has betrayed us. And that is a virus we will never be able to stamp out.
And the problem that we have now is that for whatever, however you view the larger issue, by making this decision and making it the way he did, and every candidate has campaigned on having the embassy moved to Jerusalem.
Right.
And then once they become president, Democrats and Republicans have said, we can't do that because that is going to cement something in concrete that
Kind of
no
like a
American
wall.
president can ever walk back from. Another question to you, Michael. This clearly stems from all of the reporting from the White House about the FBI agents who were having a relationship and were texting back and forth in opposition to Donald Trump during the campaign. Do you think political partisanship has skewed or compromised today's FBI and CIA agents?
Maybe I'm Pollyannish, but I really don't. Now, that's not to excuse what these two were doing. It was certainly unprofessional. It was inappropriate. And if you're involved in these sort of political investigations, they shouldn't have been doing this. And I tend to think that without knowing all the facts, it's never stopped someone on TV from speculating. I think Bob Mueller did the right thing by removing these people. So I think he responded well. We were having a little bit of this talk before when we met, and I was harking back to my 4 years running the National Counterterrorism Center, and that had people from CIA and FBI and DHS and DOD. I mean, it was the alphabet soup. And I can't recall, and this was not a period where everyone agreed on everything. We were still dealing with issues like enhanced interrogation techniques and warrantless wiretapping. I mean, big, hard issues. Taking out Anwar al-Awlaki, a U.S. citizen in Yemen. I mean, big, hardy, tough issues of counterterrorism. I honestly, this is not just me putting on my rose-colored glasses a few years later. I can't remember a single instance of a political discussion about any of it. All of it. Juan and I, I'm not a registered Republican, I'm a registered independent. I didn't vote for President Bush. President Bush made me the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Juan and I are dearest of friends. Malcolm and I just met each other, but I really like him. We simply didn't think of it in those partisan terms. We thought about how do we find terrorists, identify terrorists, kill terrorists, arrest terrorists, keep people from being terrorists, keep them from hurting Americans and American interests. And I have to think, again, this is inappropriate. I'm happy they were removed. It was dumb, though they may lose their jobs. But I really do believe, going back to one of Malcolm's earlier points, that the people in the FBI and the CIA, unless we continue to drive wedges between them from a political level, will remain in a highly nonpartisan role trying to do the right thing for the mission, serving their political leaders. But it is the political leadership in Congress and the executive branch that have the responsibility to keep these true gems in a democratic society protected and not revered so we don't evaluate them and make sure they're doing the right thing and do oversight. Not revered, but respected so they can do their job that all of us want them to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely.
I think it has to be both the perception and reality of the apolitical nature of the work. And the problem with these episodes, however one evaluates them, is it feeds and stokes this idea of a deep state, of a bureaucracy that's out to get the president. And it creates a cycle of a politicized intelligence and law enforcement environment that does nobody any good, right? And I think Michael's absolutely right. And I think it's incumbent on everybody in the intelligence and law enforcement community to be hypersensitive to both the reality and the perception of political dynamics in their work. You cannot have that happen because, especially in this environment, it stokes the worst of instincts.
And this is very speculative, but there's a question, Juan, after all the investigations are completely over, do you expect anyone to go to jail? Will the president be impeached and or forced to resign?
Easy ones.
Well, yeah. Well, the facts will lead us where they will lead us. And I have great confidence in Director Mueller. And he's a serious fellow. And he's brought a serious team to look at the facts and the data. He's already secured some convictions. So people are going to go to jail. He's getting cooperation from people. He's subpoenaing people that are closer and closer to the president.
Most significantly, now we know that Bannon is going to testify or is going to cooperate, he says, with Mueller after getting a subpoena to the grand jury.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. So all of that is dangerous in its own right because you have more people testifying. They have to testify truthfully. If they don't, they're going to be prosecuted. The more information and testimony that's out there that contradicts what other people are saying creates additional jeopardy. And in the worst case scenario, if there was some discussion or collusion with the Russians, which I haven't seen hard evidence of, but if there is something, it will come out. And if that's the case, and if the president or the inner circle are compromised in some way, and I think this is what Mueller is really looking at, not just were people in collusion to put President Trump into power, but is the president compromised in a way that weakens his status and makes suspect his control of the presidency? That's where you have the potential of impeachment, if that type of evidence
in this
would come out.
polarized society where people go to their corners in terms of what they read, what they watch, how they think about all of this, if, let's say, it's not hard facts about collusion, which is not a crime, but we know what we're talking about here, but if it is something money laundering in the past by some people around him, if there are other issues, and the decision is made not to indict, but simply to report the findings, because there has not actually been a precedent as to whether a president can be indicted. Will the American people, no matter what happens, accept the results of this investigation with all of the criticism and the tweeting and everything else? I'm not sure that our democratic institutions are going to be strong enough.
Can I make a point on this? I'm really surprised because I've been commenting on counterterrorism for the last couple of years at NBC. And what's really fascinating, besides the fact that Donald Trump claims that my book, Defeating ISIS, was the last book he ever read, people will believe every word I have to say about Islamic terrorism. Every word. And then when I wrote Plot to Hack America, which was just a raw intelligence analysis of what had to be, all right, which could spell out the single most serious national security investigation in the history of this nation, no one will believe a word I say.
Well, not no one.
No, you're right. Half the nation won't believe a word I say. But the point is, it's become that polarized. But if I go right back out and say, hey, this guy is going to carry out a terrorist attack, they'll jump right back onto that bandwagon. We've gotten to the point where if it's internal and it's part of our political process, you go to your two corners. And the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Director of National Intelligence, when they started this bug hunt in June of 2016, it started with a foreign intelligence surveillance court warrant to find if American citizens were in direct and continuous communication with a foreign intelligence agency, and as part, possibly, of a campaign, which has now led to charges of conspiracy and lying to the FBI. And in our world, the first thing we always want to know is, why are you doing this? Your motive, your underlying motive is all we're concerned about. The first thing that any counterintelligence officer is going to do is throw a financial circle around you and determine if any of your money comes from a foreign
are
intelligence
financial
agency.
and don't really relate to the election, do you think that they will?
I think Bob Mueller will indict people who should be indicted, and I think Bob Mueller will not comment on people who aren't indicted, because that is how our judicial system works. And if people are looking for Bob Mueller to provide the Magna Carta of perfection, that's not going to happen. But I can't leave people, I don't want to leave people with so much negativity. I have young kids. I'm going to be optimistic about our democratic institutions and about the country getting through this. It's not as bad as other periods we've had. It's not 1863. It's not, in many ways, 1968. We have real challenges. Ultimately, this investigation is going to end. What I want to make sure is once this investigation, I'd like to just be able to focus on the real problems and the investigation at the same time. I think that's hard for many of the reasons we've said, and that's very problematic because we've already identified only 50% of the huge number of problems we have. But what I want to happen when this investigation ends is that people in this audience on TV still have faith and trust in the institutions. Yes. That, to me, is the much more dangerous trend we're on, which is whether it's law enforcement, whether it's intelligence community, whether it's the press.
And we play a very
These
big
institutions
role
are really important, and our global leadership relies on that. It relies on the sense that when we say, I was going to say there are weapons of mass destruction, there really are, but that is a blow when we get it wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
And when our press reports something, it tries to do it right. And when it doesn't get it right, it actually says, we got it wrong. And frankly, the leader of our country doesn't attack the press, he defends the press, because that's important for our ideals and our allies throughout the globe. So, yeah, this investigation is really important. I don't want to downplay it. But what is even more important is how we come out on the back end with the institutions that have served us really well.
Absolutely.
And it's not going to be easy, but we'll get there.
Have to leave it there. A wonderful conversation with all of you. Thank you so much. Our thanks to the 92nd Street Y, to NBC and MSNBC. Thanks to you.